know it would have been better if we'd had the video, but I'll do my best to keep you reasonably entertained before lunch. I'm someone of a generation that the collapse of the wall, the Berlin Wall, was an act of optimism that fulfilled something well beyond Germany. I was born 7 years after the end of the Second World War, and I took for granted the post-war settlement and its boundaries. I remember vividly the building of the wall, the miserable separation of families, which came in time to symbolize the unbending dehumanization of communism. As I grew older, I joined the youth wing of the British Conservative Party, and through them met many centre-right politicians throughout Europe, and in particular Germany. At those seminars, I would listen to people talk about the unification of Germany with more hope than serious expectation. For all the talk of détente, there stood in this wonderful city a monument of wire, concrete, and intolerance. The monument was used by the West to show the difference between the two systems, memorably by two American presidents, Kennedy, who expressed the sentiment that all who believed in freedom were Berliners, and Ronald Reagan in June 1987, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And then it came. Not by government, but by the collapse of government, built by repression and pulled down by the people. The fall of the Berlin Wall is a reminder that walls of concrete and barbed wire are ultimately no match for the will of men and women who are determined to live freely. Equally important, that fellow citizens in uniform were no longer willing to kill people to keep families and friends separated. It was a magic moment when anything and everything seemed possible. In this jaded, cynical world, we too easily forget the power of people across the world fighting for freedom and democracy. The fall of the wall is credited with inspiring the end of apartheid in South Africa and ultimately paving the way for the first democratic elections and the elections of Nelson Mandela. In Europe and beyond, where citizens seek to determine their own destiny, we will be guided by the lessons of Berlin. Walls and oppressive regimes may endure for a time, but in the end, they cannot withstand the desire for liberty, human dignity, that is within the reach of all of us. Today, 30 years later, we celebrate the progress that's made by events on that November night. A united Germany that plays a leading role in Europe and in the world. That period was a moment in history when things were opening up, things becoming free, and everything seemed possible. It was a time when we were able to learn more about Europe's past as archives relating to the Holocaust in the former East Germany and across Europe, and in particular the former Soviet Union, were opened. The International Tracing Service, now the Olsen Archive, intensified the acquisition of documents in Eastern and Central Europe. One breakthrough was when the ITS was allowed to film the death books from the Auschwitz in Moscow, corresponding to 100,000 images. The Red Army had seized these documents in 1945. The Olsen Archive, which I have the honour to be the chair of its international commission, is a unique body of evidence of the existence of the Holocaust. Its importance will grow as the final survivors who witnessed the smokestacks, who smelled the stench of human flesh, and experienced the murder of a community around them, are no longer with us. Our experience is that when the last survivor dies, the narrative weaved into the thread of history changes and develops. Remember the recording of history of the Holocaust is different from any other history. There's a whole industry of Holocaust deniers seeking to distort the truth and to blot out the victims of the Nazis. The Olsen Archive is a vital resource in combating anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, not just in Germany, but right across the world. From a small, remote town deep in the German countryside, it has the power to throw a light on evil and the potential, with more prominent use of its resources and its records, to weave truth into the new narrative. The power of truth has never been needed more. So it was a tragedy that Glasnost was over before it had a real chance. The former Soviet archives are now closed, but for a few short months they were open. Our understanding of what happened in the killing fields of Belarus, Lithuania and Latvia were transformed. Coinciding with the closing of these archives, have seen the old enemies of prejudice return. So let's learn the lessons of 30 years ago. Get a little back of that magic and hope and openness. So, Mr. Putin, if you get a report of this conference, tear down the barriers, open up the blinds, open up your archives to the full daylight of research and scrutiny. Decades after the Holocaust, shocking and mounting evidence of anti-Semitism continues to plague Europe. Anti-Semitic hate speech, harassment, and the increasing fear of being recognized as Jewish has become the norm. Results of 3 recent European-wide surveys show that Jewish people feel at greater risk and are experiencing markedly more aggression amid a generalized increase in racial hate speech and violence in a significant, coarser and more polarized political environment. A report by the Fundamental Rights Agency found that 90% of respondents felt anti-Semitism was growing in their country, and 30% had been harassed themselves. Over a third avoided going to Jewish events or sites because of safety fears, while the proportion that had considered emigrating had increased. Nearly 80% no longer reported minor incidents because they thought nothing would change. A combination of factors have led to blame. In the past 2 decades, anti-Semitic attacks in Europe have generally peaked in line with tensions in the Middle East. But more traditional forms of anti-Semitism have reappeared. The taboos around anti-Semitism have all but disappeared, pointing to a re-emergence of long-standing anti-Semitic tropes involving Jews and money. Experts describe a perfect storm for anti-Semitic attacks, combining the increased influence of far-right groups and governments and the rise of conspiracy theories about supposed global Zionist plots, and on a scale on which they are circulated now on social media, and a general increase in the violence of public discourse. More and more people feel free to deny the Holocaust and to engage in anti-Semitic agitation. And coinciding with the inevitable disappearance of the last survivor who witnessed the Holocaust, we are entering into a new sinister age, the age of indifference, more deadly than the putrefying world of Holocaust deniers. We've grown used to confronting Holocaust denial. It didn't happen. The numbers are wrong. Poor hygiene swelled the numbers. Some small inconsistency in the mind of the denier undermines everything. Yet implicit with the obfuscation and the lies is an assumption if the Holocaust really did happen, it would have been terrible. Credible, auditive facts will always beat the wacky world of the conspirator's theory. But what if the facts are not disputed and there is just simple indifference to the events. I and others have noticed in recent years an even more sinister development in Holocaust remembrance, total and unqualified indifference. Indifference is impervious to fact. 6 million murdered by the Nazis, 500,000 Cambodians by Pol Pot, 1 million slaughtered in Rwanda. You get, who cares? It was so long ago. Stop being morbid and wallowing in ancient death. Facts no longer have the power to shock. Joseph Stalin is reported to have said that a single death was a tragedy. 1 million deaths was a mere statistic. We now face a challenge of dealing in a world in which Mr. Stalin could inhabit free, well, among other things, from the charge of cynicism. Facts and truth are no longer enough. We need to adapt to a new set of skills to deal with the age of indifference. Now, I don't know the answer to this collective shrug of the shoulders, but let's start with the good work that's been done in Germany. Last week, I was in Munich to witness Chancellor Angela Merkel honoured by the World Jewish Congress with a Theodor Herzl Award for a commitment to fighting anti-Semitism and a support to Jewish life in Germany. And clearly such an event taking place in Munich has enormous symbolic importance. At that meeting, Special Representative Dr. Felix Klein outlined the efforts to appoint a Länder-level representative who would have the responsibility of coordinating efforts to stamp out anti-Semitism. Germany has also adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, sometimes referred to as IRA, working definition on anti-Semitism, as has Bavaria, and I hope other Länders will follow suit. Acknowledged that there is a problem with anti-Semitism in schools and in the government, took action by sending 170 anti-bullying experts to do awareness training for teachers. I was pleased to read in the response to the suggestion that observant Jews would be wise not to wear kippahs, skull caps, in public, built, printed and gave away cut-out paper kippahs for their readers to wear in solidarity. The gesture failed to inspire a national fashion for a new headgear, but it's real leadership from the newspapers. Great newspapers all have a strong moral voice and built past the test. Chancellor Merkel has spoken openly about the spectre of anti-Semitism in Germany. In recent interviews with CNN, she acknowledged that, and I quote, "Unfortunately, there is to this day not a single synagogue, not a single day center for Jewish children, not a single school for Jewish children, and there does not even need to be guarded by German policemen. The Chancellor and Bildt, in their different ways, exhibit a moral seriousness that is one of the distinguishing characteristics of German public life. I agree with that. The determination of German institutions to look the past squarely in the eye, and where possible to atone for it, has provided a moral example for the rest of Europe. It's very easy to identify with those few men and women who stood against the odds at extreme risk to themselves and to their families to save Jews during the Holocaust. They are brave, they are heroes, but they are not the norm. When we look into their faces, when we see the photographs, I was talking to colleagues from Auschwitz during the break, but when you look at the people that did that, when you look at them, you're not seeing the 1930s staring back at you. You're not even seeing modern Europe staring back at you. What you're seeing is what we are all capable of being. It's easy to picture ourselves as members of the French resistance, the Marquis, or part of the partisan movement fighting the Nazis in the forests of today's Belarus. Very few of ourselves see us as being in the shoes of the perpetrators. And yet most people in occupied countries were bystanders, just waiting to survive. This was brought home to me when I was in Guernsey and one of the Channel Islands to open an exhibition entitled On British Soil, which looked at the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands. This exhibition in many ways is brave because it's a genuine attempt to address what really happened during the occupation. The exhibition showed examples of resistance and courage. It showed the consequences of resistance: shot, imprisoned, hard labour, starvation. But there was also individuals there who went out of their way to collaborate. Like Clifford Orange, the Chief Registration and Alien Officer in Jersey. He proved zealous in identifying and registering Jews. He went further than the required registration and found people who didn't qualify under the Nazis' strict rules as being Jews. Not everyone was like Clifford Orange. Despite the dangers of deprivation they faced, a small minority acted to protect their Jewish friends and neighbours. The vast majority did nothing and got on with their lives. There are still many out there who think that the Holocaust was perpetrated by monsters. No, the Holocaust was not the Holocaust was perpetrated by ordinary men and women from a society that was the most sophisticated in modern Europe. If we're to make a difference, we must all acknowledge that given the wrong circumstances, we're all capable of evil, because we're all capable of turning a blind eye. Now, I started this speech by talking about the power of crowds, pulling down walls to work for freedom. There is another side of crowd. Remembered this month that 81 years ago, Crystal Night. Senseless destruction powered by hate. So, my friends, we have a choice. We can build walls or we can pull them down. We can oppress our neighbours or we can protect them. We can live in fear or live in hope. The choice is ours. I choose hope. Thank you very much indeed.